I would say that two things are novel and important with the planetary boundary framework. One is what we need to care about for the planet's health is not only climate. We tend to, at best, get stuck only with climate. The planetary boundary framework shows that it's more than climate. But it's, on the other hand, it also shows that it's not 50 things or 100 things. It's 9 systems. I have great respect to the limits to growth, but there's a fundamental difference between the limits to growth and the planetary boundaries. We make no assumptions on how much food is required or energy is required, or what technologies we have, or you have nuclear power plants, or if you have wind offshore. We don't care about that. We only set the boundaries on keeping the planet as close as possible to the Holocene range of variability. Once that is done, we get a safe operating space. Think of it as a football pitch. The boundaries are like those lines when you play a game of football or whatever game you play. What game do we play within the space? And my conclusion is, and the conclusion of the science is, that nothing hinders us to be prosperous, equitable, and successful within the boundaries' safe operating space. And we have so much evidence that when you have constraints like that, you actually are more innovative. You're more likely to be efficient. You're more likely to actually be more competitive and actually advance yourself towards a more modern future. But putting these constraints does not hinder economic development at all. On the contrary, I think it actually stimulates faster, efficient resource use. And the limits to growth, it was criticized on good grounds that the limits to growth underestimated our ability to innovate. And that is something that the planetary boundary framework completely deliberates itself from. It makes no assumptions on this factor.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. This episode, I'm delighted that we've got Johan Rockström with us, who's an old friend of mine, someone whose work I've even written a book about. So I've got huge admiration for everything that you've done, Johan. And I'll just do the formal introduction. So Johan Rockström, the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research and a professor of Earth System Science at the University of Potsdam. Johan's also an internationally recognized scientist on global sustainability and Earth resilience, and led the development of the Planetary Boundaries Framework, which we'll talk about a lot in the next hour. And he's also deeply involved in research on the future trajectory of the Anthropocene and on tipping points in the Earth system as well. Actually, I think, Johan, you're a hydrologist, aren't you, by training? Water resources in developing countries?
No, that's right. Well, great to be with you, Mark. And yes, that's right. Originally, I did soil science and hydrology as my master's, and then a PhD in systems ecology, and then moved increasingly into climate science and global hydrology. So it's been a bit of an interdisciplinary trajectory.
And I think we met in was it Talberg? Some place in
That's
Sweden
right.
that has a big. Was it Talberg?
It was Talberg, a beautiful little village just by a lake, a very legendary lake called the Storsjön, the large lake up in Dalarna in Sweden, and a meeting that was organized as let's say, it was an attempt to do an equivalent of the World Economic Forum's Davos meeting, but focusing entirely on the planet and how on earth can we govern Earth together, basically was the theme. And that was where we brought scientists for the first time to explore what to do with all the evidence of the Anthropocene, of tipping points, and understanding the stability of the Holocene. And that's where the idea around the planetary boundary framework was born.
Yeah, I remember that. And I guess it was like Davos, but without the oligarchs and the arseholes, which was definitely nice. I think I remember Jim Hansen was there as well. Bill McKibben was there at one of the events. I think there was more than one. And and prepare for a humble brag. The King of Sweden came to my workshop in a tent at Talberg, I remember. which is, but apparently I tell people and anyone in Sweden go, well, he goes to every workshop, so there's nothing.
No. You should be proud about that. And I can tell you that my kids who are now adult, I mean, they're 23 to 25 years old, they still talk about playing football with Mark Lynas and Tellberg when they were like, what could they have been? 6-7 years old.
Yeah, well, that's because I was goalkeeper and I think I let in about 30 goals. So I think we were both delighted. But no, tell us about, so the planetary boundaries concept is obviously what you spent many years on with a whole scientific team. And that sort of formed in this meeting. Obviously, you came to the meeting with the idea already, right? So
yes.
Tell us what the process is for coming up with this, really powerful, almost revolutionary new paradigm for how we see the Earth system and the kind of current environmental predicament.
Well, I mean, definitely, we had actually almost 1 year of preparatory scientific work. It was myself together, particularly with the late Professor Will Steffen, Earth system scientist from Australian National University, together with Professor Carl Folke and a few others at the Stockholm Resilience Center, who sat down with all the Earth system science evidence that we have been, made remarkable advancements over the past 30 years through the global environmental change research programs, particularly the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which no longer exists, but the IGBP was an engine behind all the evidence of the Anthropocene and the great acceleration curves, the famous hockey stick curves showing that we're today a geological force of change on planet Earth. That was a game changer, a piece of evidence that provided the evidence that, if we're putting pressure at the planetary scale, then we need to also account and measure and set boundaries or limits at the planetary scale. The second piece of evidence was clearly the paleoclimatic science that was coming out at the time from programs like PAGES and just, all the Milankovic cycling and the Vostok ice sheet, ice core data showing, the planetary dance between 100,000 years of ice ages and shorter 15 to 30,000 year interglacials over the past 1 million year, the Pleistocene period of the Quaternary, and then how we exit the last ice age 18,000 years ago and enter this remarkably stable Holocene interglacial, the last 10,000 years of 14 degrees Celsius of global mean surface temperature, with a variability which at the time was thought to be around plus minus 1 degree Celsius, but today is understood to have been even more narrow, plus minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So what we called already then, when we met in Tellberg, you and me, the Garden of Eden, and the reference point on the planet we depend on, has been proven to be even more stable. So that was the second piece of evidence. And the third was coming out of resilience theory, of complex systems research, and the recognition that the Earth system is not only set up by a number of spheres, the atmosphere, the stratosphere, the cryosphere, the geosphere, the lithosphere, and the biosphere, but also that these spheres interact and that they have feedbacks. And these interactions and feedbacks means that biophysical systems on Earth have tipping point behavior, meaning that you have both processes, but also physical systems like the Greenland ice sheet and the Amazon rainforest, which through their fundamental functioning that has been established during the Holocene, they're dominated by negative feedbacks, which means dampening feedbacks, which keeps them in one basin of attraction. But if you erode them too much and push them too far, they can cross thresholds, meaning that feedbacks change direction, dampening negative feedbacks shift 180 degrees to become positive feedbacks, self-amplifying feedbacks, and the systems topple over and irreversibly moves into a different state, which can lead to a drift of the whole Earth system in the wrong direction. The first paper on tipping point science and the tipping point evidence came out in 2008. So literally in the midst of this work towards the meeting in Tellberg, which was actually held in 2008. So when these pieces were brought together, and I think that was what myself and Will Steffen really accomplished, was not to do so much absolute new primary data collection, but the fact that we integrated the Anthropocene evidence, the Holocene evidence, and the tipping point evidence, and the resilience theory, putting all that together, and out of that came the theory of the planetary boundary framework, which is based on two questions, very basic fundamental questions, that if we now are a geological force of change, and if we have the Holocene as a reference point for a desired planet, and if tipping points are real, meaning that we have to avoid pushing the system too far across thresholds, then question number one, obviously, is what are the environmental processes and systems that regulates the stability, the resilience, and the functioning of the Earth system? And question two, is it possible for each of these, once these boundary processes are identified, can we, for control variables that regulate these processes, quantify a safe boundary, a boundary beyond which the science shows that we're likely to generate irreversible changes in the functioning of the Earth system, but stay within them, and we have a high likelihood of remaining within a Holocene-like interglacial basin of attraction, which we concluded very early in the work that is the planet we depend on. That's the only state of the planet that has scientific evidence that it can support the modern world as we know it. And we can come back a bit deeper to why we can say that. But that was basically the if you call it the breakthrough point in the science, was to integrate these different strands of science and take it to the next level and develop a theory around it, which became what we call today quite strictly actually a planetary boundary framework. It's not a concept, it's actually a whole framework. It has a methodology, it's reproducible, it is transparent, it's based on analytics and data, and it brings in multiple disciplines, but it has a kind of a coherent methodology.
Before we get too much into the sort of academic discussion of the planetary boundaries, maybe can you just tell us what they are, and if you can remember some of the numbers? I mean, I've tried doing lots of talks on this, and I can never remember all 9, at least the 9 that were originally proposed, even though I wrote a book about it. So you probably have a better memory than me, but just for the uninitiated, this is a very smart audience, but we've got all ages. People haven't necessarily heard about this already. So just give us the quick planetary boundaries, overview.
Yeah, no, and again, so we're not listing important environmental issues here. We are actually doing nothing more, nothing less than setting out to find the environmental processes and systems that regulates the state, the functioning, and the life support on Earth. And we have identified 9 planetary boundary processes. And of course, no surprise to anyone, number one of those is a stable climate system. So here you have climate change being one of the boundaries. We have 2 more boundaries, which I often describe as being in the family of planetary scale boundaries. These are boundaries that have scientific evidence of tipping point behavior at the planetary scale. The climate system, the stratospheric ozone layer, which protects the Earth system and the life support on Earth from dangerous UV radiation, and finally ocean stability, which we have used ocean acidification as the process to indicate the stability of the ocean. So those are 3 boundaries that operate at the planetary scale. They're kind of regulating the function at the planetary scale. Then you have 4 what I call biosphere boundaries, which are the boundaries that do not have scientific evidence of planetary scale tipping points, but they operate under the hood of the planetary machinery to slowly but surely regulate the buffering capacity of the planet, and they interact then with the big 3. And to no surprise, I think, to anyone, number 1 of them is life on Earth, biosphere integrity. It is the genetic diversity and the functional diversity, basically the ability of forests or wetlands or grasslands or marine systems to remain stable thanks to the diversity of species and diversity of genetics in those systems. The second is land system configuration, which is we've learned in the Holocene that when temperatures settle down and hydrology settle down, we got a certain configuration of peatlands, wetlands, rainforests, temperate forests, boreal forests. So the composition of these land use systems is set as a boundary. Then, of course, the bloodstream of the Earth system itself, the hydrological cycle, the global freshwater cycle, which is behind all life, all carbon sequestration, all photosynthesis, all biomass on Earth. And then finally, the sister cycles to carbon, namely the biochemical cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus, so the nutrient cycles. So there you have the four biosphere boundaries. Think of them as the nature boundaries: biodiversity, land, fresh water, and nutrients. And then we have finally three more human related boundaries. And they're human related because they tend to be, let's say, unnatural to the Earth system. And number one is aerosol loading, which is air pollutants, which is the dimming of the lower atmosphere because of sulfates, nitrates, black carbon, all the smog in cities, which aggregates up to a level where they actually impact on the energy balance between the northern and southern hemisphere, but even impacting on monsoon rainfall systems. And then we have novel entities, which is the loading of human created chemicals, everything from PFAS to microplastics, nuclear waste, and persistent organic pollutants. And finally, which I mentioned earlier, the stratospheric ozone layer, which is a chemicals related boundary. So there you have the nine. Again, I grouped them in kind of three groups: the big three: climate, ozone, and ocean. The four biosphere boundaries of biosphere integrity, land use change, fresh water, and nutrients, and the two kind of chemicals and pollution related: air pollutants, aerosol loading, and novel entities. The most difficult one to quantify, by the way, the over 100,000 of new chemicals that are out in the market and where we have limited safety standards on. So those are the nine, and under these nine, we do identify control variables, and one boundary can have several control variables. So, for example, for climate, we use carbon dioxide concentration and climate forcing. So, not surprisingly, we use multiple data sets to monitor these nine boundaries.
And climate forcing is what watts per square meter of
that's basically the heat injection in the system from all greenhouse gases. So that is watts per square meters. Yes.
Right. What was so strong and so revolutionary about these boundaries, as I think you were about to say before I interrupted you, was that they have quantified values as sort of a safe space and a dangerous space. Talk to us a bit about how those work.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is, two things are novel and important with the planetary boundary framework. One is, what we need to care about for the planet's health is not only climate. We tend to, at best, get stuck only with climate. The planetary boundary framework shows that it's more than climate. But it's, on the other hand, it also shows that it's not 50 things or 100 things. It's nine systems. And these are now, after 15 years of scientific advancement, there's been over 1,500 peer-reviewed scientific papers, even with planetary boundaries in the title. A lot of scrutiny, a lot of critique, a lot of debate, back and forth. And I can say with with very little hesitation today that, we still have a lot of research that we need to do on the boundaries to get better precision on the safe boundary levels. I'll come to those quantifications, more control variables, new data. But today, I can say with high degree of confidence that if we become clever stewards of these nine, then we have a good chance of keeping the planet in a state that can support current and future generations of humans on Earth. So that's what those nine represent. But for each of those nine, we identify control variables, and these control variables, we quantify a safe boundary level across the scientific assessment of evidence. So just to give you an example here. So for climate, we use a concentration of carbon dioxide as one of the control variables. Why? Because carbon dioxide is the dominant greenhouse gas. It is long-lived in the atmosphere. It is well measured. We have data for it for long time series. And we scan through the science and have come to the conclusion that the uncertainty range for moving from a safe state to the risk of causing irreversible changes lies somewhere between 350 and 450 ppm of carbon dioxide concentration. Okay, so that is what we call the uncertainty range in science. And one part of the planet boundary theory is that we have, the whole framework. I'm very clear that it's an objective framework, but there's one normative decision that we've taken, which is we place the safe boundary at the lower end of the scientific uncertainty. That admittedly is applying a precautionary principle. You could place the boundary in the middle as a median of the uncertainty range, or even closer to the higher end of the uncertainty range. But we've chosen to place the boundary at the lower end of the uncertainty range. So that's where you go from the green safe level into what we call the danger zone. And the danger zone, which we often in our presentation of the data show in a yellow color, which is also inspired by the IPCC, then the Governmental Panel on Climate Change, which uses a burning embers color scheme. When you go deeper into higher risk, you move deeper and deeper towards red and then purple colors to show the gradual increase of likelihood of causing permanent damage. And we use the same. So when you go from green into yellow, you enter this uncertainty range. And then when you reach the upper end of the uncertainty, the 450 ppm part, that is where you go from yellow-orange into red. And we call that the high-risk zone. So importantly, yes, the planet boundary framework, a unique feature is we quantify for all these 9 boundaries, giving us a safe operating space that we can account against. But admittedly, and this is something we have to learn, it's a risk assessment. It's not giving us the exact number when the planet kind of goes from a stable state to an unstable state. We're saying that you breach a boundary and you enter a danger zone. That's the zone where science shows things is likely to happen, but we don't know exactly where. But if you exit that uncertainty zone and enter the red zone, then you are very likely to cause permanent damage. So it's a kind of a gradual scale, but the boundary is placed in a precautionary basis in the lower end of that uncertainty. And we have been, and that's just important to also recognize that this is ongoing research. It isn't until 2023, so basically almost 15 years into the planetary boundary science, that we were for the first time able to quantify all the 9 boundaries. Up until then, we've had major struggles to quantify the aerosol boundary, the novel entities boundary, and continuous work on the biodiversity boundary, which is really complex to get full quantifications of. And while the 9 boundaries have stayed intact, we've had shifts in control variables over the years. So the science does advance, but now, and when we meet here today, we actually have a fully quantified safe operating space for the Earth system based on the planetary boundary framework. And that is it's very satisfactory as a starting point. But of course, I foresee that we'll see improvements in these quantifications as data is added, new analytics, new science is performed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I think that's a really clear and useful sort of explanation. But I often wonder: is this a human relevant concept only that applies in the Holocene? So, well, and maybe the Anthropocene now. So the last 10,000 years since the end of the Ice Age, or is it resilient throughout geological time in a way? Like, because you could have a lower end to the CO2 boundary. Like, if you get below 270 parts per million, you get an ice age, right? So it's not always about going up. And do the boundaries apply in the hot periods in the Cretaceous or something like that? Or previous mass extinctions? Have the boundaries been transgressed to cause those mass extinctions or something? Have you tried looking at it through paleoclimatic time, or is it really just something which is relevant to the modern era?
So Yeah, that's a really good question, and I would say that the our let's say our understanding today, let's put it that way, because we haven't, we don't have the full evidence here, but our understanding today that it is a framework that works essentially throughout the whole quaternary, so the past 3 million years. Um, but you cannot go beyond the quaternary. But I would argue nobody can go beyond the quaternary in terms of claiming um, climate forcing levels or the functioning of your system, because beyond the quaternary, we are essentially outside of anything that resembles chemically, physically, or biologically, or geologically, the planet of today. It's only when you enter the quaternary that you start having the continental composition, the chemistry in the ocean, the atmosphere, the freshwater cycle that even comes close to the planet of today. And it's not until you enter the Pleistocene and the latter part of the quaternary, and only in the last 1 million years, that you start seeing a planet that moves around the sun according to the Milankovitch cycles, that we have these 100,000 year ice ages, that is 5 degrees Celsius colder mean temperatures on Earth. And then we have these shorter interglacials where temperatures rise with between 5 to 7 degrees Celsius. And we stay in these interglacial periods for 15, 30,000 years and then enter ice ages again. And this dance between ice age and interglacial is all related to the elliptic cycling of the planet around the sun, solar cycles, and of course the wobbling of the Earth's axis. And I argue quite strongly that it's only this period, this last million years, that is of any relevance for guiding our human understanding of the planet that we depend on as a species on planet Earth. So you're right; it's in that sense a very anthropogenic framework. How can I say that? Well, I can say that for the simple reason that how long have we existed as modern Homo sapiens on planet Earth? Well, actually, just over the past 250,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we have only existed through 2 ice ages, and this is our second interglacial.
Mm-hmm.
And so we basically lived through, well, over 90% of the time that we've existed on planet Earth, we've lived in ice age. I mean, that's kind of our default is deep ice age. And when you look at that, we were hunters and gatherers, we lived in caves, we had massive environmental fluctuations, a really rough time to be a human being on planet Earth. And then we leave this last ice age, and the genetic codes of all life on Earth, not all, but the predominant part of life on Earth has existed even beyond the 1 million years. But it's only in the Holocene that it settles down. I mean, that's what is quite interesting, that, the ice sheets, the sea levels, the marine coral reef systems, the forest systems, the biomes of boreal, temperate rainforest, they all settle down in the Holocene. It's in the Holocene. It all kind of comes together. So that is why I think there is a strong argument to say that the planetary boundary framework is generic. You can apply it throughout the whole quaternary. I think you can apply it definitely through the Pleistocene, but admittedly, it is shaped as a reference point for a planet that can serve humanity. It's not. I mean, simply put, the planet doesn't care in whether it's breaching or not breaching the boundaries. We care about staying within the safe space, because staying within the safe space gives us a high chance of having a Holocene-like planet, and that's the planet we all depend on.
Mm-hmm. So let me put you on the spot with another test, and this is not just an excuse to plug my new book on nuclear war, but let's say there's a nuclear war, and how do the boundaries represent that? You've got an atmosphere, you've got a stratosphere which is full of soot. The temperature plunges by 10 degrees in a nuclear winter. There's radioactivity everywhere. There's a nuclear famine, and most of the human population dies off. a mass extinction, presumably, because most of the biosphere wouldn't be able to survive the darkness, the cold, the loss of photosynthesis, and all of the primary production. So, like, what does that do? How would you represent that in the planetary boundaries framework? It's a different kind of transgression from making it too hot by emitting all this carbon and destroying species in our normal agriculture and all of that. So give us a nuclear war on planetary boundaries.
No, and unfortunately, it can be very well represented in the planetary boundary framework. I mean, the control variable that would catch it first is the novel entities boundary, because that's where nuclear waste or a nuclear war would be represented through the novel entities loading of radioactive materials in the Earth system. Then you would immediately have an exponential rise of radiative forcing, which would be caught through the control variable on climate, which would go in deep red immediately. You would kill off all life on Earth, which would immediately push the genetic diversity and functional diversity boundaries right into the deep red zone. So here you have climate and biodiversity would be blinking, at a force majeure point immediately. You would probably destroy the freshwater cycle. So you would also get both green and blue water control variables, which are set dependent on the variability during the Holocene. But you would, we see that already now, that already at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming that we see today, the impacts on the hydrological cycle is very dramatic, because you get so much more heat into the Earth system. So you evaporate so much more water. So we're powering up the hydrological cycle, which deviates outside of the Holocene range. And you would probably currently we have 110,000 cubic kilometers of precipitation falling on land each year. I don't know what would happen in a nuclear war, but you would certainly bump that up to levels that would also put you in a deep red force majeure blinking on fresh water. And so I think you would immediately see a planet assessment with the planet boundary framework showing that we would be in deep trouble, triggered by this novel entities smash, represented across multiple boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's good to know. It can show that. I mean,
it wouldn't help us much, but it would give us a diagnostic.
Exactly. There was some pushback when planetary boundaries was first proposed. I remember my friends at the Breakthrough Institute writing quite a harsh rebuttal. And I'm going to struggle to characterize that usefully, but I think it was something along the lines that these were sort of too subjective, that they were, normative, and that the idea that there were scientifically objective numbers that you could apply to these things they pushed back on. And I think also they were a bit triggered by seeing planetary boundaries as basically just a reinterpretation of the old limits to growth philosophy from the 1970s. Was there anything in that? What was your response to some of these concerns?
Yes. So, well, now I think there's so much water under the bridge. I think one can be quite transparent about what happened then. And to be honest, Mark, this critique came out, was timed with the Rio +20. It was very, very deliberately timed at a time when all heads of state gathered in Rio to develop the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. And that was when the planetary boundary framework was communicated very, very closely with Ban Ki-moon and the whole team that was developing the Sustainable Development Goals framework. Actually, planetary boundaries was even written in as a proposed guiding framework for the UN in the 20-year follow-up of the Rio Conventions. And exactly at that time, the Breakthrough Institute decided to create this not questioning the framework, but just doing what skepticism and denialism has been very clever at doing for decades on climate and for decades on tobacco, to simply instill uncertainty that we cannot say for certain that this really is robust enough. And that, I think, was ultimately the objective here, because it silenced down immediately afterwards. It was a report, a gray report, that was just thrown out there, just saying that, look here, we cannot quantify these things at a planetary scale, and these are not well established numbers, and it was kind of a critique that was quite shallow, but in the end, it did create exactly what they, in my view, were after, namely the sense that this is not scientifically established, and they succeeded in part as well, because particularly the Brazilian government became too concerned about naming planetary boundaries specifically. As you may remember, there was a very big debate between the civil society groups in Rio versus the policy groups. The civil society groups wanted to maintain planetary boundaries in the texts. So I'm not saying that this that this Breakthrough Institute report was the tipping factor here, but just to place it in context, that I would argue that report had very little substance in its critique, and we did provide a rebuttal, and wrote that and published that, and after that, I feel that there was very little critique coming back from the Breakthrough Institutes following on that, and today it's completely silenced out, and not only that, we've actually come to a point today, Mark, that the planetary boundary framework is so comprehensive and so robust that it's almost becoming a more let's say appealing and policy and business aligned framework than the climate science itself. That when you talk about fresh water, air pollution, chemicals, biodiversity, land as one, agenda, it is much less, much more difficult for skeptics or denialists to question you, because you're simply addressing so many of the fundamentals that are impossible to question. I mean, nobody can question the importance of fresh water, clean air, and functioning ecosystems. And we can today prove through the planetary boundary science, which, by the way, the climate science does so well today also, that if you do not come back into a safe operating space on the nature boundaries, you also fail on the climate boundary. We can today show so clearly that even if you phase out coal, oil, and gas, you still fail on the Paris Climate Agreement, because if you continue allowing deforestation and loss of biodiversity and overuse of fresh water and degradation of land and overloading of nitrogen, phosphorus, and air pollutants, you will also push the Earth system outside of the 2 degrees Celsius boundary, because it all boils down to resilience. Mm-hmm. It boils down to the capacity of the Earth system to buffer stress. And this was not the case in the beginning. It was not the case at the Rio Plus 20 when this Breakthrough Institute report came out. And but now, 15 years down the line, if you open the IPCC assessment, or if you open the IPBES assessment on ecosystems, or if you go into the United Nations Convention on Desertification, increasingly you see Earth system approach to addressing the specific areas, for the simple reason that we see how different boundaries are hitting back on their sister boundaries. And the biggest factor is how the Earth system interacts with the climate system. And so by the end of the day, I think that the early days of critique, I mean, all critique to the planetary boundary framework, when it's let's say when it's honest, I think is really valuable, is incredibly valuable. But that report in specific today, I'm really critical to the way it was handled.
I mean, I was pissed off at the Breakthrough Institute as well, because it was just 6 months after I'd written my book, The God Species, which was all about the planetary boundaries. And I loved the framework. I loved the way the boundaries interact. I thought it was a really useful way to address environmental challenges so that they didn't look overwhelming and impossible to tackle, because there's only 9, but you do need to recognize how biodiversity and climate and water and all of those things interact, so you don't just solve one in a singular way which then affects all the other 8. So yes, but that's my selfish concern against the Breakthrough Institute too, and that was an earlier variant of the Breakthrough Institute. But I'll have to ask Ted Nordhaus to come and see whether he still holds to that view, maybe in a future episode. But with the God Species book, which by the way was my least successful book, because I think it was just because I was trying to do something a bit weird, which was to put a kind of eco-modernist gloss on what is fundamentally quite a environmentalist perspective. But I thought it was useful to do that, because otherwise you do get a kind of limits to growth perspective. And a lot of people have interpreted the planetary boundaries this way. It's like there's a fundamental level beyond which humans cannot, the human species cannot grow or cannot develop or cannot continue to innovate and do new things and have new technologies. And I wanted to show actually that if you just take, nuclear, that's a good example. Environmentalists at that time hated it, but actually it could help us meet several of the challenges of the boundaries, so long as you don't put radioactivity everywhere and transgress that one. So, I thought that was useful, was to show that it was resilient to lots of different political kind of conceptions. I don't know whether you agree with that, in the sort of in hindsight or not.
No, I totally agree, and it's good that you raise the limits to growth. I mean, I have great respect to the limits to growth, and I've worked quite recently with Jürgen Anders, and have good relations. But there's a fundamental difference between the limits to growth and the planetary boundaries, and the difference is that in the limits to growth, the team at MIT integrated both human needs, technology, and the capacity of the environmental systems to deliver against those needs, and our ability to practice or to deliver on those needs. So it was from the very outset an assessment of how much does humanity need and how much can we perform and how much can the environment provide. And as soon as the needs exceeded what the environment could provide, you were in overshoot, and overshoot led to impacts which were costly. The planetary boundary framework does something completely different. It actually, the thought experiment that I think helps a lot here is that the first thing we do is we take all humans on planet Earth and place them on another planet. So we simply say, for a moment, just sit down on another planet, and then we look at Earth, and we ask the question, what will it take biogeochemically to keep the planet in a Holocene interglacial state? That's the question. Without humans, just irrespective of humans, just understand the biophysical functioning of the Earth system. And that's where you get the 9 boundaries, and that's where you get the control variables, and that's where you get the quantifications of the safe boundaries. We make no assumptions of how much food is required, or energy is required, or what technologies we have, or you have nuclear power plants, or if you have wind offshore. We don't care about that. We only set the boundaries on keeping the planet as close as possible to the Holocene range of variability. Once that is done, we get a safe operating space. Think of it as a football pitch. You get the line. Within that line, you can play your game. There's even a referee that blows a whistle if the ball goes out. So you're not allowed to go outside of that pitch. The boundaries are like those lines when you play a game of football or whatever game you play. You put humanity back, and then you can play your game inside those lines. And we know that you can play a very lousy game, or you can play a game like Messi or Maradona or really Champions League type game. So that is what it's all about. What game do we play within the space? And my conclusion is, and the conclusion of the science is, that nothing hinders us to be prosperous, equitable, and successful within the boundaries safe operating space. So we're only providing a boundary that quantifies for all the systems that regulates the function of the planet, which means actually that every boundary translates to a budget, and the budget has to be, operated within. And we have so much evidence that when you have constraints like that, you actually are more innovative. You're more likely to be efficient. You're more likely to actually be more competitive and actually advance yourself towards a more modern future. So this business of thinking that we have this infinite planet that we can simply grow infinitely on leads to inefficiency and unsustainable outcomes. But putting these constraints does not hinder economic development at all. On the contrary, I think it actually stimulates faster, efficient resource use. So I'm entirely with you here. And the limits to growth had the same outset, but because it merged these factors together, human needs, human technology, and environmental limits, it was criticized because it was criticized on good grounds that the limits of growth underestimated our ability to innovate. And that is something that the Planetary Boundary Framework completely deliberates itself from. It makes no assumptions on this factor. And just to give you one example how this has led to a lot of debates, the nitrogen boundary is set very, very, it's a very, very constrained boundary. It's to basically you have to reduce reactive nitrogen use as a fertilizer with 75% to come back into the safe boundary level. And we set the boundary level only on how much reactive nitrogen can the biosphere tolerate before you get major anoxic events and then flip over the functioning of the living biosphere. And nitrogen scientists over the years have published papers saying that this is impossible because you cannot feed humanity within the safe boundary on nitrogen, even if we apply the best agricultural practices we know. So you do conservation tillage, you do regenerative agriculture, you do the best we can, and we need more nitrogen than you're allowing us to use within your budget of the planetary boundary science. My answer to that is saying, well, sorry, we only take the planet into account. I've been suggested several times, shouldn't you adjust the nitrogen boundary so that we can come to reasonable levels so that we actually at least can feed humanity within your safe space? And I say, look, that would completely destroy the framework because the framework is only about stability of the planet. So yes, we have a headache here. I've so far seen not one scientific analysis, even the most optimistic transformations analysis, that can bring us back to the nitrogen phosphorus boundaries and still feed humanity in a stable way. We're not far away from being able to do it, but it's still a major challenge. And I think this is something we have to simply recognize that is one of the challenges we're facing. But I think also it's one of the values of the Planetary Boundary Framework that it stays strictly on quantifying the safe space for the planet, not for human needs.
And so these figures are objective, and they're scientifically objective.
Correct.
And defensible in scientific terms, largely because of tipping points, right? Or is it about degradation, and are they a bit different in the different boundaries? Because I want to talk a bit more about where we are in the current situation and how close to climate tipping points you think we might be.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. For the different boundaries, we use different lines of evidence to quantify the safe boundaries because we don't have tipping point behavior across all the boundaries and don't have evidence of tipping points across all the boundaries, at least not yet. So line of evidence number one, where do we place the quantitative safe boundaries to avoid cross tipping points? Yes. Line of evidence two is actually that we have more and more data showing the range of variability for the control variables across the Holocene. So for freshwater, for example, it's based on avoiding to go outside a kind of a one standard deviation outside of the most extreme variation of the hydrological cycle during the past 10,000 years. And then a third line of evidence is the evidence where you see aggregation of collapse of, for example, freshwater systems at scale and what that could imply as a feedback on, for example, the climate system. So no tipping point, but just that let's say aggregate buffering capacity. If that is lost, then that can also qualify as evidence for quantifying the boundary. But so there are different lines of evidence, but ultimately it is about avoiding irreversible changes, which is essentially tipping point dynamics.
Mm-hmm. And so moving on to where we are currently, I mean, I've seen a couple of your more recent talks, and you sound really concerned about the current state of the climate. There's this fairly rapid warming in the last couple of years, which seems to be not fully explained. Tell us, is this keeping you awake at night?
Well, no, I continue sleeping quite well, to be honest. But I've never had reason to be as concerned as today, and it's really not only about the geopolitics in the world. It really is the scientific evidence we have that we're not making progress. We're not bending the curves. We're going deeper and deeper into the red zone on the planetary boundaries. And not surprisingly, therefore, we're starting to see the first indications of a planet losing its strength to buffer the stress caused by our unsustainable abuse. And this is what really, really makes me nervous, that we're seeing an acceleration of warming. We're seeing forest systems losing its capacity to take up carbon. We're seeing massive changes in the marine systems. The latest data on the fourth consecutive and worst ever bleaching event, recording collapse of tropical coral reef systems. These are early signs of a planet which is indicating biogeochemical reduction of its resilience, and this is something which is not well recognized. That the moment we are in trouble, but the moment we are in real trouble is the moment the planet shifts from being what I call our best friend, meaning continuing to provide this capacity to reduce heat imbalance by absorbing heat in the ocean and carbon on land. And it's one of these basic facts that one of the key functions of the Earth system is to have ice sheets. And that is captured in the planetary boundary framework through the climate boundary in particular. So that gives us albedo, which is it reflects back heat to space thanks to the white surface of ice. But also that 4% of the heat injected by our fossil fuel burning is consumed when melting ice. So the very effect of accelerated ice melt is actually a buffering function of the Earth system. And now we're seeing that ice melt is accelerating, and we are seeing loss of inland glaciers much faster than we had expected. And then all of this is an early warning sign of a system losing resilience. And that is what the planetary boundary framework is fundamentally about. So yes, there is real reason for concern. And finally, this is something that is often misunderstood as well out in media. It's like that I am, or we scientists are kind of raising our language and our volume of concern increasingly just because we want to be heard more. But the reality is that, already in 2018, when the IPCC 1.5 degrees Celsius report came out, and when we had published our second planetary boundary assessment, we said that we are entering now a decisive decade for humanity's future on Earth. I mean, you could find my quotes on that, now almost 10 years back. And that the purpose of saying that was not that we need to solve all the problems by 2030, but we need to bend the curves by 2020 and have a decisive movement back towards a safe landing within the safe operating space by 2030. So cutting emissions by half by 2030, halting loss of biodiversity, shifting the loading of nitrogen. All the boundaries need to have seen by 2030 a decisive movement in the right direction, so that we can have a safe landing sometime around 2040, 2050. Now we are in 2025. We're halfway into this decade, and we're making no progress. we're making zero progress. We're actually moving still in the wrong direction. Is it so surprising then that we raise our volume of concern? Of course it's not. I mean, it's the evidence is that the Earth system is losing it's faster than we had expected. Actually, it's like the resilience seems to be going down faster than we expected, and we're not making progress. Combine these two together, and of course it lands in a signal of deep concern.
Yeah, I think personally I'm emerging from a 2-year period of optimism into something else. And it's partly these indicators, it's partly what's happening to the climate out there, and just this very rapid warming that we've seen in the oceans, which is like off the charts from what you might expect from even the background level of warming. And the optimism was about all the net zero targets, China having a peaking date for coal, the big progress in electric vehicles and batteries and solar and all of that, and looking at the projections, and we'd be like, all right, we'd be about 2.5 degrees. It wasn't going to be 6 degrees, which was my worst case scenario from a decade and a half ago. And that's, huge progress, and isn't it great? But here we are at 1.6. And as you say, we're seeing the worldwide collapse of coral reefs. We're going to be seeing the total loss of Arctic sea ice probably within a few years from now, which will change the energy balance at the top of the planet. There's some signs that the biosphere, so forests, as you were saying, isn't absorbing as much carbon as used to be the case, so more is going to accumulate in the atmosphere. It just feels like such a dangerous time. And at the same moment, you have the Trump administration coming in and eliminating even the mention of climate from all of its activities, communications, and trying to push us back into the fossil fuel age. And these are thinking human beings. So the response to scientists saying we've got a problem here isn't necessarily for Homo sapiens to say, well, let's fix it. It might well be to just say, let's pretend it doesn't exist. Let's go backwards. Let's fundamentally deny it and even go as far as almost in a malignant way trying to make things worse. So it's difficult, I think, to be optimistic as we sit here right now.
No, it is. It's very difficult to be optimistic right now. I mean, the only light in the tunnel as I see it today, I mean, there are two lights in the tunnel. I mean, number one is that we know that we are in a very mature state when it comes to sustainability. And one should never forget that we have not only made progress, but we've actually built a strong foundation. And we see that opinion poll after opinion poll, that 60-70% of citizens around the world, they do still, they are concerned about climate change, they trust climate science, they want climate action. So we should never forget that we're not suddenly, sliding backwards and just saying goodbye to the basic understanding that we have a global planetary scale problem. And secondly, the light in the tunnel is what you alluded to. I mean, I think it's clear that we're seeing double-digit penetration of sustainable solutions across many of the boundaries. It's not only on energy, it's also on the food system, on aerosol loading, on chemicals, we haven't signed the plastic treaty, but there are global frameworks that are being worked on in a very serious way. So those are at least two lines of development that one has to kind of hold on to very tight at this point. Right as we speak, there is the Planet Change gathering in Paris. You soon have the London Climate Week. All the gatherings that I've been to recently, a big ocean summit in Paris hosted by President Macron. There's a very strong willingness to stay on track, and that collective action is absolutely needed in this moment of backtracking from the U.S. administration. So I think it's very unfortunate what we're seeing in the U.S., but I think it would be a big mistake to let that dominate too much what we are, the efforts that we are still trying to make. And as a closing remark, on this, Mark, is also that one of the beauties in this whole story is that a question is it possible to move into exponential positive change? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes. And how come? Well, it's simply because we know that the solutions, the decarbonized, sustainable, within planetary boundary related solutions for human development have multiple benefits in the other end. Better for health, better for prosperity, better for competitiveness, is more advanced, is simply more attractive, more stable, more secure. And this is generally forgotten. We've unfortunately allowed ourselves to talk about all these planetary boundary challenges as environmental issues, which are all about protecting, conserving, and backing off. It's incredible that we can still allow voices to say, well, we can't afford to solve this problem because it means less socioeconomic development. As we know, this is simply an incorrect statement. We know that investing in sustainability has, of course, a transaction phase. There's an investment phase. I mean, we've powered the global economy for 150 years with coal, oil, and gas, and now we're going to power it with renewable energies. Of course, there's a transition phase, but we know we all become winners in the other end. And I think this is something that is really reassuring, because given that we have, we're sitting with the winning plan, and therefore exponentials can occur, because it is when large enough minorities adopt these winning strategies that they, of course, become exponential, for the simple reason that they're so attractive that they simply outcompete the planet damaging incumbents. So I think working along that path must still be the line of action in a way.
Well, thanks so much, Johan, for ending on a positive note, because I think there's nothing more disempowering than doomism. And we've got to work our hardest to innovate and to accelerate and to do all of these amazing things that you've outlined so eloquently. I think the bad idea that you might have been saving the world from for the last 15 years, Johan, is that there's no such thing as planetary boundaries. You've been a huge influence on my work, and I think you've been a huge influence on global environmental science. So keep doing what you do, and all power to your elbow.
And thanks for inviting me. Great talking to you, Mark.
Thanks, Johan. Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a WePlanet podcast. WePlanet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list, and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.